In the face of one of the weirdest matchmaking outcomes I've ever seen, where the strongest kingdom in the game got paired against two of the other strongest kingdoms put into a war camp together, it got me thinking about the Imperium system as a whole. Is it working, or did it create a series of consequences that were truly unintended and perhaps created the exact situation that it was designed to prevent? Now, I don't have all the answers in this video, but I do have what I think are some good questions, and definitely leave a comment with your thoughts. And in case you hadn't seen, okay, two of the strongest kingdoms in the game. I mean, like, we talk about the strongest kingdoms in the game. We're talking about 1093. We're talking about 1960, okay? We're talking about 2489. We're talking about, of course, 2377. There are others that go in this list as well, but 1960 and 2489 are in a war camp together. And if you haven't seen the statistics, okay, these two kingdoms in the same war camp have 35 billion, I believe it's Imperium power, and 4.9 trillion kill points. I want you to think about that number for a second. 4.9 trillion kill points. It is possibly the strongest war camp ever created in the history of the game. And why is that? Well, these are two Imperium kingdoms put together to fight 1093. They have 39.4 billion alliance power in their top alliances and 3.4 trillion kill points in those alliances in 1093. That is insane. The funny thing about this is that this signals that the developers kind of think that when we were fighting in the KVK with 1093 and 1960 many KVKs ago, the developers think 1960 should have taken an ally because they're literally giving them an ally now. They're not even letting them choose. They're like, no, you're having an ally. Your ally is going to be Imperium, and like it or not, that's happening. And here we are. I don't know, whatever. They're allowed to make their choices. Let's get back on topic. How did we get to this place where we can say with a straight face that it is fair matchmaking to actually put let's call them the number 2 and number 3 kingdom together in order to fight the number 1 kingdom? Isn't this the exact situation the Imperium system is designed to prevent? And again, I don't have the answers here, but we're going to ask some interesting questions. To understand this problem, we actually need to travel back in time, back before the Imperium system existed. And once upon a time, you could actually migrate to any kingdom you wanted without restriction. It was an absolutely massive growth of communities that happened during that time. And these kingdoms would have 6+ alliances. I mean, it was crazy the kinds of things you could create. I believe 1846 made the biggest kingdom at one point with like 10 alliances or something insane. It was a crazy time to be a governor in Rise of Kingdoms. It's hard to believe you could squeeze that many players into a kingdom. And back in the day, when I had to walk uphill both ways, kingdoms were truly massive. Now, in order to really prevent these powerhouse kingdoms from absolutely dominating the game, the developers implemented the Imperium system. And the way that this works is kind of up on the screen here, but the short version of this is that the game looks at the top 300 players in a kingdom by power and says, okay, we're going to judge your kingdom based on those players. Now, is 300 players by power the right number to be looking at? I actually don't have the answer. These days, it feels like it's actually less than 300 players that are actually in kingdoms. Most kingdoms are turning into these one alliance kingdoms. But regardless, they look at the top 300 players by power, and players that are over 150 million are calculated at 150 million. And the top 24 that are in that designation are branded as Imperium. Players over 35 million power cannot go to those kingdoms, okay? Now, this absolutely had the effect of curtailing the growth of the powerhouse kingdoms, and I'll argue it had a number of likely unintended other consequences. I kind of want to talk about those consequences in this video as we explore how Imperium impacted the game. Did it improve it? Did it make some things worse? And the first thing to talk about is obviously community health, because as soon as you get this designation, this branding as Imperium, you can't bring players into your kingdom unless you go through some shenanigans, which we'll talk about, like hospital filling in just a minute here. But there are definitely some consequences. One of them is that communities ultimately shrink and die. Community health absolutely becomes a problem. Players, look, it's like natural for some number of people to move on to other things in their life and attrition to do other things. Any game, anywhere, anytime is going to have attrition. But an Imperium kingdom can never really recover those players. Not really. They have to drop so low on power that it just typically doesn't happen. So ultimately, these communities that flip Imperium, when you look at the history of them and the big ones that are out there, they ultimately all strangle from the restrictions of not being able to bring in people. In addition to the restrictions of bringing in people, you've got to remember that players play to win. And you got to respect that players will play to win. That's not a player problem. That's things that players will do in any game ever. But the first thing you realize is if the Imperium designation is a power restriction, then where do we have power that we can get rid of? I'll just pull up 1093 just to showcase again this Imperium designation. We'll put it over here. So because of this designation, it became very obvious that if you weren't already zeroing your deadweight for your matchmaking reasons, now it's time to zero your deadweight for Imperium reasons. So zeroing low contribution players makes them not want to play anymore. They quit. But not only do you now need to zero players in your own kingdom, also players need to fill their hospitals to get into migration. Now, I've genuinely never understood why this continues to be a mechanic in the game, why it is that hospital power doesn't count toward a kingdom's total power, but it doesn't, which leads to the gamification of this thing, where everybody fills up their hospital in KVK because you have double hospital capacity. That power doesn't count towards your Imperium power now, and then you can migrate more people in. The weirdness of this is that all Imperium kingdoms have to play the same game, so it just creates a situation where everybody needs to spend resources and speed-ups in a way that doesn't gain fun. And the craziest part is that some kingdoms, in fact, many of the biggest kingdoms, only can maintain their Imperium status because every player deletes troops. Does that sound crazy? The biggest kingdoms are all deleting many millions of powers worth of troops every KVK in order to remain lean enough to bring in more people. Now, this creates other problems with regard to being able to actually fill garrisons and rallies with main accounts, but there's a solution for that that players have arrived at very naturally, which is that, okay, if we can't get more players to come to the kingdom to fill things, not even newer players, that are just interested in filling stuff, then the thing we'll go and do is make more accounts ourselves. I mean, if you can't get more bodies into the kingdom, in terms of like real players that are different humans managing accounts, then let's just have the humans we have all manage more accounts, right? And so this created the farm meta. Now, the farm meta is kind of wild, where players create dozens and dozens of accounts. They passively train their troops. I've talked in a prior video on how you can use this system to get millions and millions and hundreds of millions of troops passively training for your kingdom for free. This became so strong. Ooh, somebody's getting banished. Hey, yo. This became so strong that the domain system was introduced to the game. And the domain system basically limits the number of accounts that can actually be registered for a KVK, which I think is a very important change because the farm meta had gotten really out of hand. And even at 900 to 800 accounts in your registration is still pretty crazy how many of those accounts are actually not more humans that play the game, but they're all just alternate accounts, farms of other people. And I'm mentioning all of this because the farm meta has gotten so weird and the troop deletion problem has gotten so pervasive that main accounts can only kill off their troops basically when they get to Kingsland. And to prevent yourself from losing those main troops, what you need to do is you need to have farms filling the rest of the time. So because the fort meta exists and you can put down fort on fort on fort on fort on fort on fort on fort, and that is the meta for how to defend a zone, it makes it so that for weeks on end, rallies are filled with farms, a skeleton crew of main accounts are told to come online and protect the farms as they go to fill the garrisons, but then the garrisons are all defended with farm troops as well, and it's like farm versus farm for as long as possible. And like, don't take my word for it. I mean, literally 1960, when they were arguably the strongest kingdom in the game, they did this for weeks on end. So like the best kingdoms in the game do this. So it's not a matter of if this is powerful, it's a matter of how much your kingdom understands that the game revolves around the power of not draining your mains when you could instead drain a farm. This in turn has actually led to a rebirth of farm killing, which is kind of interesting. So now being a player who runs around with like super toxic amounts of march speed, killing farm accounts and putting hundreds of thousands of troops into the hospital for farms is in my opinion, not a fun meta to be in. It sucks to be the player on the farm getting decimated. And I don't know, I guess if you're the person doing it, maybe inflicting pain is something you enjoy, but like you do get some pretty wild reports. I've heard, I've never done it. At least it's been years since I've run around with like a farm killing march, right? So are these things that are just optimizations for how a kingdom runs? Or is this truly an impact of the Imperium system? When we talk about deadweight zeroing, you could argue that for matchmaking reasons, it was important to do that anyways. I will argue, I wonder, like, why isn't that matchmaking always looked more closely at the contribution of a player? That way, matchmaking wouldn't penalize you for having a low activity player. You would know, like, right, this player doesn't do anything. We know they're deadweight. We don't count them as harshly towards your matchmaking. Don't worry, you don't need to zero those players. So I would think there was a deadweight zeroing solve, but I don't know that it exists in the game today. So deadweight zeroing probably should have been happening either way, with or without the Imperium system. And when it comes to troop deletion and hospital filling, for the purpose of bringing people into a kingdom, we're talking about the expenditure of resources without the addition of fun. I think that is exclusively a consequence of the Imperium system. The farm account meta arguably would have been valuable regardless of whether or not you could bring more people into your kingdom. So I would say that that would have needed to have been addressed either way. So we got to ask the question, what if the Imperium system had never existed? Would we have a different outcome than we have in this KVK today with 1093, 2489, and 1960 being put in the same war camp? Because what that situation is one of the biggest kingdoms in the game being so much bigger than all the other kingdoms that the only way to get a match made against them is to put the two other most strong kingdoms in the game guaranteed as allies together to ensure that that fight unfolds the way that I think the developers would intend to be fair. So if the Imperium system had not existed, then communities would not have died from sort of strangulation. They would die of their own failings, and plenty would fail all on their own, okay? I would know all about that. A small number of communities would probably have grown larger than all the others and would have had difficulty with matchmaking, but that's no different than the problem that has existed with Imperium kingdoms since the dawn of the Imperium designation. And perhaps more players would still be playing the game if they hadn't been zeroed for contribution or told to be deleting troops regularly, or if they could just play with their friends, because you can go to these kingdoms and you don't have to worry about how competitive they are and so on. Now, perhaps with adjustments to the Imperium system and matchmaking and how all that works, you could improve and tweak it so that none of these larger kingdoms like 1093 would continue to exist. But would it be good for the game? I honestly don't have the answers. So I went and I polled all of you to see what you think, and let's pull up those results. 51% of people think that the Imperium system is good, 23% of respondents thought that it was bad, and 27% actually just wanted to see the results of the poll. So if we eliminate the sort of 1/4 of people that said, hey, I just want to see the results, you're looking at about 2/3 that said it's good and 1/3 that said it's bad. So maybe I'm just crazy here. Maybe the Imperium system is a net positive for the game. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. It's just kind of interesting to look at these systems and over the years how they evolve. I don't have the answers. I don't know what a better solution would have been, but if you've got ideas, drop them in the comments. And if you want to see more information about this KVK with 1093, 1960, and 2489 being in the same war camp, I'll have a card in the end screen in just a second.